Montana Territory, early autumn, 1882. The wind cut low across the valley as the morning sun cracked over the Bitterroot Range, casting long shadows across the gold of the grasslands. Cold air clung to the earth, and the silence was broken only by the creak of saddle leather and the soft whinnying of a bay mare. Callum Lark had not planned to ride this far west. He was meant to be heading south, toward Virginia City, chasing a lead on a herd of stolen cattle. But instead, he was here following the sound of crying. He dismounted just past the broken fence line, boots crunching dry leaves as he stepped into the clearing. A small cabin stood by the edge of the pine woods, weathered and leaning heavy on one side like it had given up trying to stand straight. Smoke curled from the chimney, but the front door was open wide, swinging gently in the breeze. Inside, the cries were clearer now, high-pitched, frightened, and belonging to a child. Callum's hand rested on the butt of his holstered Colt as he stepped into the doorway. The scent of cold ashes and old wood filled his nose. He found them tucked beneath a threadbare quilt on the floor, 2 children, a girl and a boy, no more than 6 and 4. Dirty cheeks, wide eyes, and trembling lips. The girl clutched her brother tighter when she saw him. He crouched slowly, keeping his voice low. "Hey now. I'm not here to hurt you. My name's Callum." The girl blinked, tears on her lashes. "Mama's gone." "Gone where, sweetheart?" The boy whimpered. "She said she'd be right back. But it's been a long time." There were no other signs of life in the cabin. Dishes sat cold on the table. A shawl hung by the door. And near the hearth a rifle lay untouched. Callum's jaw tightened. He glanced out at the woods, then back to the children. "What are your names?" "I'm Ada." "He's Amos." "All right, Ada. Amos, let's get you out of here." He wrapped them in the quilt and carried them both to his horse, hitching them up securely before climbing in front. As he rode off, he kept looking over his shoulder, hoping, maybe, their mother would come running from the trees. But no one came. 2 days later, he reached the small town of Alder Creek, tucked in the low hills west of Bannack. He took the children straight to the sheriff, but the lawman had no answers. No one had reported a missing woman, and the cabin was too far out for most folks to know who lived there. "We can send word to the mission in Missoula, see if they can take the children," the sheriff offered. "No," Callum said too quickly. He looked down at Ada, holding tight to his trouser leg. "I'll keep them with me for now, just until I find out what happened to their mother." The sheriff gave him a long look. "That's a lot to take on." Callum just nodded. "I know." He rented a room above the general store and settled the children in. He bought them boots and fresh clothes, and a wooden horse for Amos that made the boy smile for the first time in days. But he still had no idea what he was doing. That was when he met her. Penelope Arden stood behind the schoolhouse desk with a chalkboard full of numbers behind her and an air of quiet strength around her. Her hair was pinned back, but loose strands framed her face, and her brown eyes fixed on Callum like she was trying to read every thought he had ever had. "I teach the younger ones in the mornings," she said, hands folded neatly. "If you leave Ada and Amos with me, I can keep them busy and out of trouble." Callum shifted in the doorway. "I do not want to burden you." "It is not a burden," she said, simple as anything. "They need routine. And safety. I can give them those things." He hesitated, but then Ada reached for Penelope's hand and smiled up at her, already trusting her in a way that came naturally to children who sensed goodness. So he nodded. "Thank you." Penelope looked back at him. "You are not their father." "No, but you care for them. I could not leave them behind." She softened then, her voice low. "That tells me all I need to know." Days passed. Callum rode out each morning, asking around about the cabin, the missing mother. No one had answers. But each day he returned to Alder Creek, to the children, and to Penelope. He would find her with chalk on her fingers and straw in her hair after tending the school garden. She listened when he spoke without interrupting. She did not flinch when he told her about the war, about the men he had lost in Tennessee, about the long years drifting west with no real home. "You have one now," she said one evening after supper, "even if you do not know it yet." He looked at her then, really looked. The firelight danced across her face, and something in his chest tightened. "And you? You have someone?" "No, why not?" She smiled, a little sad. "I have not found a man worth trusting with my heart." He stepped closer, his voice rough. "Maybe you have not looked in the right places." She met his gaze and did not look away. 2 weeks later, they found the mother. Callum had ridden out again, following a tip from a ranch hand who said he saw a woman matching her description near a creek 5 miles north. He found her body beneath a ridge, caught between rocks, her dress torn and arms bruised. She had tried to cross, likely chasing game. The water had been swift. He buried her beneath the cottonwoods and carved her name into the cross with his pocket knife. "Sarah." He told Ada and Amos the truth gently. Penelope was there, holding Ada when she cried. Amos just stared at the floor, silent. That night, Callum sat outside the schoolhouse, staring up at the stars. Penelope came to him without a word, sitting beside him on the stoop. "They are yours now," she said quietly. He nodded. "I cannot give them everything." She touched his hand. "You give them what matters." He turned to her, heart pounding. "I do not know how to do this. Be a father. Or anything else." "You already are," she said. "And you are not alone." He leaned in slowly, testing, watching her eyes. She did not pull away. Their first kiss was not fiery or rushed. It was steady, warm, and full of something deeper than want. It was a promise. By the next month, Callum had built a small house on the edge of town. Penelope helped hang the curtains. Ada picked wildflowers for the table. Amos followed Callum everywhere, a little shadow in boots too big. One evening, Penelope stood in the doorway, watching Callum show Amos how to saddle a pony. Her eyes filled with quiet joy. Callum came to her, brushing her hair back behind her ear. "I love you," he said, voice low. "I did not mean to fall this fast. But I did." Penelope smiled up at him. "You are not the only one." And when he kissed her again, with the children laughing in the yard behind them and the sun dipping low over the hills, it felt like the start of everything good. They were not just surviving anymore. They were home. Morning crept in through the lace curtains Penelope had sewn from old muslin, casting a pale light over the room where Callum now slept most nights. The children still stirred early, and the sounds of Ada's quiet humming and Amos's footsteps on the kitchen floor had become the music of Callum's dawn. He rose slowly, careful not to wake Penelope. Her hair lay unpinned across the pillow, and one hand rested near his on the quilt. She'd fallen asleep mid-sentence the night before, too tired to finish telling him about some dispute between 2 of her students over a lopsided apple pie. He watched her sleep for a moment longer before swinging his legs over the bed and reaching for his trousers. Downstairs, Ada stood on a stool, trying to reach the flour tin while Amos tugged at the hem of her dress, asking if he could crack the eggs. Callum stepped in before the tin hit the floor. "Let's not start the day with a spill," he said, lifting it down for her. Ada sighed dramatically. "I knew I could do it. You just don't trust me yet." "That's not it. I trust you not to fall, but I trust gravity to win." He ruffled her hair, and she leaned into it, grinning. By the time Penelope joined them, they were seated around the table with hot cornmeal mush and dried apple preserves. She kissed Amos's head before sitting, her eyes still heavy with sleep. "I dreamed we had chickens," she said as she reached for a spoon. "And one of them kept getting into the schoolhouse." Callum poured her coffee. "That might not be a dream for long. Mr. Dobbins has a clutch of pullets he's looking to barter. I was thinking of trading some labor for them." Penelope raised an eyebrow. "You? Bartering? I thought you were allergic to town gossip." "I'm not bartering with the women. Just Dobbins. And he only gossips about weather and feed." Ada wrinkled her nose. "Do chickens really need a clutch?" "No," Penelope said, "but we need eggs and chickens need company. It's better that way." After breakfast, Callum loaded his tools into the wagon and hitched the mare for a trip out to the collapsed barn behind the schoolhouse. The school's roof had held through last winter, but the barn hadn't fared as well, and Penelope had been hauling firewood from a neighbor's shed for weeks. He intended to change that before the next snow. The children stayed behind with Mrs. Eddings, the widow who lived 2 doors down and had taken a shine to Ada's chatter. She'd been the town's midwife once, and though her own children had long since grown and gone, she welcomed the company. Callum worked through the morning, stripping down the old beams and measuring what could be salvaged. Penelope arrived near noon with a basket of fresh bread, boiled eggs, and a jar of pickled onions. She sat on a stump while he ate, her fingers curled around a tin cup of water. "You're quiet today," he said between bites. "I've been thinking," she replied, watching the wind stir the grass. "About what happens next. Next year. And the one after. You've taken on everything without complaint, but we've never talked about what you want. Not just for the children, or for me, but for yourself." He set the cup down. "I want this. The 4 of us. I never thought I'd say that, but I do. I want a home that doesn't feel like I'm borrowing it from someone else's life." "And the cattle? The riding out alone? You were chasing something before all this." "Maybe I was." He looked past her toward the hills. "But I think I was just running from something else. The quiet here, it doesn't feel empty anymore." She nodded. "Good. Because I've been offered a parcel of land north of the creek. It's small, not much for farming, but it's got a well and room for a garden. The town council wants to move the schoolhouse closer to the new church. I teach out of the house." He smiled faintly. "You've been busy." I asked around. Quietly. He wiped his hands on a rag. "You want to move? I want space where the children can play without worrying about wagons rolling past. And a place that's ours, not borrowed above a store, not shared through town politics. Just ours. I'll build the fence." She looked up. "You'd be all right with it?" "I wouldn't be anywhere else." That night, Penelope sat on the porch steps with a lantern beside her and a sheaf of old letters in her lap. The late summer air was warm, but the wind carried the edge of the coming season. Callum joined her after settling the children, the weight of the day sinking into his shoulders. She passed him one of the letters. "These came from the agency in New York. I never told you exactly how I ended up here." He unfolded the page slowly, reading the neat, looping script. The words were bright, at first hopeful, even eager, but the last paragraph sat heavy. A rejection. Her would-be husband found her spirited nature unsuitable for frontier life. Too much laughter, too many questions. Too much of everything. He folded the letter and handed it back. "He was a fool. I was embarrassed. I told the stage driver I'd already married. Couldn't go back. I stayed at the boarding house, taught a few children for coin, cleaned linens. I didn't know what came next. You didn't need him." "No. But I thought I did then. I thought I had to be smaller to be loved." Callum didn't answer right away. He watched the fireflies wink in and out across the yard. Then he said, "I've never met anyone who made silence feel so full." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he rested his hand on hers. A week later, they stood outside the new house, barely framed and roofed, with Ada running circles around the porch posts and Amos dragging a stick along the dirt furrow. Penelope handed Callum a tin of nails and pointed to the beam that needed reinforcing. "We'll need a root cellar," she said, brushing sawdust from her apron. "I'll start digging it tomorrow. And a cradle." He looked at her, startled. She nodded once, calm and certain. "I've missed a moon. Maybe 2. Callum reached for her hand. "Are you all right?" "Yes. I'm strong enough now." She looked toward the children. "We all are." He let out a long breath. "Then we'll build more than a home. We'll build a life." The wind blew sawdust up around them, and in the quiet that followed, Penelope laughed, not the reserved kind she sometimes used in town, but the full, unguarded one that rose from her belly and filled the air like a song. And Callum, quiet as ever, smiled with his whole face. Because here, in this place and with this woman, even silence had found its voice. The first snow came early that year, sifting down over Alder Creek like flour through a sieve, catching in the high grass and outlining every fence rail and wagon wheel in soft white. The ground hadn't frozen deep yet, but the cold settled into the bones of the town, and folks moved slower, wrapped in wool and layered flannel. Pipes steamed above rooftops and windows glowed orange with lamplight long before supper. Callum stood in the half-built doorway of the new house, one hand braced on the frame, watching the snow gather on the ridgepole. He hadn't covered the roof fully yet, and the exposed beams would need cleaning come morning. He didn't mind. It gave him something to do with his hands, something that felt like progress. Behind him, Penelope's voice called from the kitchen where she was organizing the root vegetables they'd traded from the Bransons. She hadn't slowed since they'd moved in 3 days earlier, her energy quick and purposeful, every step a decision. I found the last of the wax paper, but the seals on the jar lids are brittle. Next year we'll have to set aside coin for proper preserves. Callum turned, brushing snow from his hat. We'll make do. I'll take a look at the pantry door, 2 hinges are off. She lifted a crock of dried beans onto the shelf and straightened slowly, resting a hand at the small of her back. Her breath caught just a little, and Callum's brow drew down. You sore? Some. Not bad. He crossed the room and rested a hand lightly at her waist. You've been lifting too much. Her eyes met his without argument. I know. I just want everything in its place before the baby comes. We've got time. She leaned into him a little. I don't like waiting. I've noticed. She laughed, quick and low, and the sound warmed the space between them. Beneath her apron, her belly had begun to round, just enough to show in the slant of her posture and the way she held herself when she rose from a chair. He'd noticed her sleeping more in the late afternoons and the way she turned her face from strong smells. She never complained, but he saw it all. He kissed her temple gently and reached to take the next crock from her hands. That night, after the children were asleep and the fire burned low, Penelope sat by the hearth with her mending basket while Callum sharpened his drawknife. Outside, the snow drifted against the porch posts, and the wind moved through the eaves with a whispering hush. She threaded her needle carefully, her voice quiet but steady. I received a letter today. From my sister. Callum looked up. I didn't know you had a sister. Half-sister. My father remarried when I was 12. Amelia was born a year later. She's 17 now. Where is she? Back east, in Albany. She wrote to say our father passed. Consumption. She's alone now. Callum set the knife aside. You want to bring her here? I don't know yet. She's never been outside the city. She's clever but delicate. My stepmother died years ago. She's been living with an aunt. But now there's talk of sending her to a cousin's in Connecticut. She doesn't want to go. You think she'd take to life out here? Penelope folded the fabric in her lap. No, not at first. But she's young, and she's mine to look after. I always meant to send for her once I was settled. Callum nodded slowly. Then we'll send for her. When the pass is clear come spring. Penelope looked at him then, eyes full of something grateful and deeper than any words. You're not afraid of much, are you? He shrugged. I've seen worse than a 17-year-old girl. She's not just any girl. Neither were you. She laughed again, softer this time, and leaned back against the chair. She'll ask 1,000 questions. She'll probably hate the food. And she'll think I've gone half mad choosing to stay here. Callum reached for another log and placed it on the fire. Let her. She'll learn. Later, once the house was dark and still, Penelope lay curled against him beneath the quilt, her breathing slow, her hand resting over the place where new life stirred. Callum stayed awake for a while, listening to the wind and the faint creak of settling beams, thinking about the shape of things to come. By December, the schoolhouse had been moved, rolled on logs by a team of draft horses and half the men in town. Penelope resumed teaching once the walls were patched and the stove replaced. Ada joined the older children for lessons while Amos sat in on the younger group, mostly drawing shapes in the dirt outside until Penelope coaxed him in with picture books and warm bread. Callum took work where he could, shoeing horses for the livery, hauling timber, mending fence. He never stayed gone long. Winter daylight ran short, and by dusk the family was always gathered around the table, bowls of stew warming their hands and stories passed between bites. One afternoon, as the first real storm of the season blew in, Callum returned from the north slope with frost clinging to his whiskers and his coat stiff with ice. Penelope met him at the door with a towel and a frown. "You're late. Snow came faster than I thought." She took his hat and gloves, setting them by the stove. "You look half frozen." He knelt to unlace his boots. "Cabin near the ridgeline, old trapper's place. Looks abandoned. Thought it might be worth salvaging the firewood." Penelope handed him a mug of broth. "You didn't bring any back." "Not yet." "Wanted to ask if you'd heard of anyone claiming it." She shook her head. "Not that far out. Most folks stick closer to town now. I'll ride up again when the wind settles. If it's empty, we can use the lumber." She sat beside him, resting her hand on his knee. "I wish you'd take someone with you next time." He looked at her gently. "I'll be careful." "I know. But it's not just you anymore." Her other hand moved to her stomach and he covered it with his own. By the end of January, Penelope's belly had grown firm and full. She moved slower now, her steps thoughtful, and Ada had taken to shadowing her like a little nurse, fetching blankets and smoothing her skirts. Amos, less certain what to do, offered up his drawings, laying them carefully in her lap each evening. One night, as a gale howled outside and the walls rattled, Penelope asked him to read aloud from the old book of prairie poems she kept on the shelf. Callum wasn't much for reading out loud, but he cleared his throat and did it anyway, his voice rough but steady. Ada fell asleep against Penelope's side halfway through, and Amos drifted off with his head on Callum's thigh. After the last page, Penelope turned her face toward him. "I used to read those to myself when I first arrived here. The words made me feel less alone." "You're not alone now." She nodded. "I know that. But I think I needed to hear it." The next day, the town doctor stopped by during his monthly rounds and confirmed what they already suspected: the baby would come before the thaw. Callum walked him out afterward, boots crunching in the deep snow. "Anything we should be worried about?" The doctor adjusted his scarf. "No signs of trouble yet. She's strong. But it'll be cold. Make sure the stove stays lit and keep water boiling when the time comes." Callum watched him ride off, the doctor's mare moving slow through the drifts. The wind had stilled for now, and the sky held that pale, aching blue that only winter knew. He stood there a long while, his breath curling up into the empty air, until he heard Penelope call from inside. That night, as they lay in the quiet, she took his hand and placed it over her belly. The baby kicked once light, but certain. Callum closed his eyes, holding on to that small, sure motion. "Do you remember?" she whispered. "When you told me silence didn't feel empty anymore?" He turned his face toward hers. "I remember." She smiled against the dark. "It feels full to me now." And in that moment, with the fire low and her hand in his, he knew it would stay that way. The last week of February settled over Alder Creek like a held breath. Snow still blanketed the earth, but the light had changed. It lasted longer, slanting gold against the barn walls and catching in the strands of Penelope's hair as she stood on the porch in the late afternoons, one hand resting beneath her ribs, the other curled around a mug of warm milk. Callum watched her from the woodpile, his gloves stiff with cold, his breath rising in soft gusts. She'd taken to humming again, low and easy, half-forgotten melodies from her girlhood. They carried on the wind, slipping between the eaves and following him into the house long after she'd gone inside. Amos had taken a liking to the garden plot, though it was still buried under snow. He spent hours with a stick, poking at the frozen earth, tracing rows where he imagined carrots and beans might grow. Ada had claimed a corner of the parlor for her sewing, determined to stitch a quilt before the baby arrived. Penelope had shown her how to piece the squares, but it was Ada who chose the fabric scraps from Callum's old shirts, worn pillowcases, and the faded hem of Penelope's first apron. The house had begun to feel lived in the way a home does when time and care have soaked into its beams. The wood groaned as it settled. Boots lined the wall near the door. A ribbon, once bright blue, now dulled with dust, fluttered from a nail above the hearth. Ada's doing, for luck. That morning, Callum rode out toward the abandoned trapper's cabin he'd seen weeks before. The sky was clean and wide, and the mare's hooves broke through the crusted snow with steady rhythm. He took the long way, crossing over the frozen creek and cutting through a stand of old cottonwoods. Beneath the trees, the wind died, and all he could hear was the creak of leather and the faint hush of the mare's breath. The cabin stood just as he'd left it, sunken a little more on one side, its door hanging from a single hinge. He nudged it open with his boot, stepping inside. Dust hung in the still air. A rusted stove sat back against the far wall. The roof had held mostly. In one corner, a pile of old traps lay tangled beside a stack of empty flour sacks and a broken chair. He found a bundle of dry kindling under a tarp and stacked it in his sack, along with a few lengths of board that might serve for patching the barn floor. As he turned to leave, his eye caught on a small, leather-bound book wedged behind the stove. He pulled it free carefully. The cover was cracked and brittle, the edges scorched. Inside, the pages were filled with tight handwriting, names and dates and short, clipped entries about snow, traps, hunger. A man's life, captured in brief strokes, ending mid-sentence. Callum tucked it into his coat and stepped back into the light. By the time he returned home, the sun had dropped low behind the ridge. He found Penelope asleep in the rocking chair, her head tilted back, one hand draped over her stomach. Ada sat nearby with her sewing in her lap, watching her with a quiet protectiveness that hadn't been there months ago. Amos was curled on the rug, arms wrapped around a stuffed calico cat Mrs. Eddings had sewn from leftover cloth. Callum slipped inside and set the sack down without a sound. He stood near the fire, warming his hands, listening to the tick of the stove and the soft breath of his family. When Penelope stirred, her eyes found him first. "You were gone longer than usual. I stayed to look over that cabin. Found a few things that might help fix the barn floor." She sat forward slowly, brushing hair from her face. "Did it feel like someone left in a hurry?" "No. More like someone stayed too long." She nodded, then reached for his hand. Later, after supper, Callum brought the leather book from his coat and set it gently into her lap. "I thought you'd want to read it." She opened the cover carefully and traced her finger down the first page. "He wrote in ink," she murmured. "That's rare out here." He kept a steady hand. They sat together, reading in silence until the fire burned low. The book didn't name the man, but his words carried the weight of solitude and the kind of patience born from long winters. Penelope closed it gently and rested it on the table. "I'll keep it near the schoolhouse," she said. "Let the children see what a life looked like, even if no one remembers his name." March came in with sleet and hard wind. The roof groaned under the weight of ice, and the mare limped from a stone lodged in her hoof. The days passed in tasks hauling water, boiling linens, sanding the cradle Callum had built from pine boards left behind at the mill. One morning, Penelope paused while sweeping the kitchen. Her face went still, the broom slipping from her hand. Callum caught her before she reached the floor, lifting her gently to the settle by the stove. She gripped his wrist, her voice unsteady but clear. "It's time." He sent Ada flying to fetch Mrs. Eddings, who came with her shawl half-pinned and her boots unlaced. Amos stayed close to Callum's side, solemn and wide-eyed. The house shifted into motion, water boiling, linens laid out, fire stoked high. Penelope didn't cry out. Her breath came sharp and shallow, her grip fierce as she rode each wave of pain. Callum stayed at her side, wiping her brow, whispering when she needed it, holding silence when she didn't. Hours passed. The wind howled outside like it meant to tear the walls from their nails. But inside the house, time narrowed to one room, one bed, one breath after another. Near dawn, the child came. A girl, slick with birth and quiet at first, until Mrs. Eddings rubbed her back and coaxed a thin, wailing cry from her lungs. Penelope exhaled, tears slipping down her cheeks as the child was laid against her chest. Callum sat at the foot of the bed, hands shaking, heart thundering louder than any war drum. Penelope looked at him, her voice frayed but sure. "She's strong." He reached out, fingers brushing the baby's dark hair. "She's you." Ada and Amos crept in quietly, their faces pale with worry. Callum beckoned them close, and together they stood at the edge of the bed, watching the newest piece of their world take her first breaths. In the days that followed, the storm broke. Sun returned in slivers through the window panes, and the snow began to soften underfoot. Penelope rested, the baby always near. Ada took to singing lullabies while she swept, and Amos insisted on sleeping with his boots by the cradle. In case she needs guarding, Callum repaired the barn floor, one board at a time, while keeping the baby's bonnet in his coat pocket. He'd never been one for tokens, but the feel of the soft fabric between his fingers steadied something inside him. One evening, as dusk fell and the family gathered near the hearth, Penelope reached beside her and drew Callum down to the rug. She rested her head against his shoulder, their daughter nestled between them. "Have you thought of a name?" she asked. "I was waiting." "For what?" "For you to choose one." She smiled, slow and certain. "Then we'll call her Mercy." He looked down at the child, her eyelids fluttering in sleep. "That fits." Penelope leaned into him, her voice low. "Do you remember the day we met?" "I do. I thought you looked like a man who'd forgotten how to hope." He didn't answer right away. Outside, the wind lifted faintly, brushing against the windows. "And now?" he asked. "Now you look like a man who's found what he didn't know he was missing." He turned his face toward hers, their foreheads touching, the warmth of the fire wrapping around them. And in that moment, in the hush between one day and the next, Callum knew the life they had built, slow, quiet, stitched together with laughter and labor, was not just enough. It was everything. The thaw came slowly in fits and starts. Some mornings frost still clung to the fence rails like stubborn lace. But by midday, the sun softened everything, drawing the scent of wet earth and old pine from the hills. The snow receded from the fields in ragged patches, revealing flattened grass and the first stirrings of green, and the creek behind the house began to run again, a narrow ribbon of meltwater threading its way past the rocks, louder each day. Inside the house, Mercy had begun to lift her head. She blinked at the world with a solemn gaze, her small fists always curling and uncurling against the wool of her swaddling. Penelope kept her close through the days, resting when she could, though her thoughts had already turned towards spring plantings and the return of her sister, Amelia, who was due within the month. Callum had taken to rising before dawn. He'd built a small coop behind the shed and was in the process of fencing in a patch of land for what Penelope called their kitchen garden. The cabin had grown into something more than shelter. It breathed now with the shape of their days, its corners filled with the rhythm of a life built slow and deliberate. One morning, as he returned from the creek with a pail of water, he found Penelope at the table with a stack of folded cloth, Mercy asleep in the sling across her chest. She looked up as he stepped inside, brushing a curl back from her cheek with the back of her wrist. "I've been thinking," she said, not bothering with a greeting. He set the pail down and leaned against the wall. "About the school," she said, adjusting Mercy's head gently. "I want to ask the council to let me keep it here. Just the younger ones. The main schoolhouse can stay by the church, but this house sits better for the little ones. Before they're ready to sit still and hold a slate." Callum nodded slowly. "You think they'll agree?" "They'll grumble. But most of them have children who prefer it here anyway. And if I don't ask, they'll assume I never meant to." He crossed the room and rested his hand on her shoulder. "You're not asking for yourself." "No. I'm asking for them. For the ones who need a quieter start." He squeezed gently. "I'll help build the benches." The day warmed as it unfolded, and by late afternoon, the breeze carried the scent of damp straw and something faintly sweet, sap, maybe, or the first wild crocus poking up through the thaw. Ada and Amos played at the edge of the field, dragging twine between fence posts in a complicated pattern Ada insisted would become a trap for dreams. Mercy slept in her cradle, her breath a soft whisper beneath the murmur of the wind. Penelope sat on the porch steps with her sewing, her eyes trained on the line of hills beyond the creek. Callum joined her, settling beside her with a slow exhale. She didn't look at him when she spoke. "Do you think Amelia will last through the summer? She made it across the country. That says something. She's never been west of the Hudson. She's expecting tea parlors and lace curtains. She'll get sunburn and horseflies. Penelope laughed, low and surprised. She'll hate it. Maybe. But she'll have you. She turned to face him then, eyes searching. You don't mind her being here? He shook his head. No. It'll be good for the children. And for you too. She's headstrong. So are you. She'll want to help. Let her. Penelope leaned her head against his shoulder. The quiet between them easy. Sometimes I forget how much I missed her. You'll remember soon enough, he murmured. When she starts telling you how to churn butter properly. That evening, Callum sat with Amos in the shed, showing him how to check the hinges on the coupe door. The boy had grown taller, a little leaner, his face more watchful. He didn't ask many questions, but he listened closely, his small hands mimicking Callum's exactly as they moved along the wood. Later, as they walked back toward the house, Amos spoke without looking up. I want to help with the planting. Callum adjusted the sack over his shoulder. You will. Can I have a row for myself? He paused. What would you plant? Corn. And beans. And something for Mercy. Callum nodded. We'll mark it off this week. The next morning, Penelope received a telegram from Missoula delivered by the post rider who always smelled faintly of tobacco and wet wool. She opened it by the stove, her face unreadable. Callum waited until she folded the paper and set it down. She's coming on the first freight wagon from Helena, she said. Day after tomorrow. He reached for his coat. Then I'll ride out, meet her at the station. No, she caught his sleeve. Let me. I want her to see me there. I want her to know this is mine. All of it. Callum looked at her with quiet pride. Then I'll watch the children. The day Amelia arrived, the sky held a pale yellow glow and the road was dry enough to stir dust. Penelope wore her second-best dress, the one with the blue stitching at the hem, and tied her hair back neatly. She rode into town with her shoulders square and her chin high, Mercy wrapped against her chest. Callum watched her go from the porch, Mercy's bonnet disappearing over the ridge. That evening, the wagon returned with two figures seated side by side. Amelia was taller than Penelope, with a thinner frame and hair the color of old rye. Her eyes darted from the house to the fields to the children waiting by the fence. When she stepped down, she hesitated just for a moment before crossing the yard and folding Penelope into a long, silent embrace. Callum stepped out to greet her, wiping his hands on his trousers. You must be Callum, she said, eyes sharp. Penelope told me you had a quiet mouth and a good back. He nodded once. And you're Amelia. I am. I brought tea. And a book of Greek verse I doubt anyone will read. Then you'll fit in fine. That night, the house was full. Amelia unpacked slowly, asking questions about the stove, the water bucket, the neighbors. She took one look at the outhouse and declared it a temporary insult to civilized life, and then rolled up her sleeves and helped Penelope with supper. After the children were sleeping, Callum found Penelope standing in the doorway of the spare room, watching her sister lay out her shawl across the foot of the cot. She's not what I remember, Penelope whispered. No one is, he said gently. But she's here. She turned toward him, something unspoken in her eyes. I didn't think I could have all of this. You didn't take it, he said. You built it. She stepped into him then, fitting herself against his chest, her arms slipping around his middle. Thank you for giving me room to do it. He held her close, his hand resting over hers. You gave me something to come home to. Spring deepened. The creek ran strong, the first shoots of corn pushed through the furrows in Amos's garden row, and the hens began laying with regular rhythm. Amelia settled into the rhythms of the house with surprising ease, teaching Ada how to twist her hair into braids and reading aloud to Mercy in the evenings, her voice soft and sure. By June, the schoolroom was filled with the sounds of children tracing letters and Penelope's chalk moving steady across the board. Callum worked the fields in the morning and repaired tools in the afternoons, his hands calloused but steady. One evening, as the sky burned orange and the wind rustled high in the trees, Penelope stood barefoot in the garden. Mercy balanced on her hip. Callum leaned against the fence, watching her tilt her face to the sky. She looked over at him then, her eyes shining in the last light. "You know," she said, "I think I finally believe this is real." He stepped toward her, brushing her hair back behind her ear. "It's real." They stood together in the hush of the evening, the house behind them lit with the golden warmth of oil lamps, the smell of baking bread drifting on the air. Ada's voice filtered through the open window, reading aloud to Amos from a book Amelia had brought, her pace slow and careful. Penelope leaned into him, resting her head against his chest. "We could have missed all of this. We didn't." They stayed like that as the stars came out one by one, the wind soft and warm, and the world quiet around them. And in the stillness of that moment, with nothing left undone and everything they loved close at hand, Callum kissed her, slow and certain, as if the rest of their life had already begun.